Welcome to this episode of Creston Valley Curiosities. I'm Tammy, the curator of the Creston Museum, and as always, I'm delighted to be able to share a little bit of the community's story with you. Today, we are going to explore the civil defense era in the Creston Valley. We hear a lot of talk these days about a rules-based world order, a way of organizing international relations based on predictable rules and cooperation. Even as that new world order was being established in the years following the Second World War, there was a lot of worry about what it would look like, how it would be implemented, and how on earth it could ever survive. The shadow of the previous war loomed large. Communism and the Eastern Bloc were an ominous and growing presence in the minds of many in the West, and the possibility of nuclear war in this atmosphere of heightened tension was an ever-present threat. The idea of defending against enemy attacks on local communities grew out of the Second World War. With Allied ground forces swept off of the European continent very early in the war, the only real way the Allies had of carrying the war to the Axis powers was in the air. This led directly to bombing raids on German cities and industrial centers. The Blitz in London and the attack on Pearl Harbor showed Allied civilian populations just how easily those tactics could be turned against them. So throughout the Second World War, we see fairly extensive efforts, even in quiet inland Creston, to prepare for that eventuality. In both World Wars, we had militia units, the 107th East Kootenay Battalion in World War I and the Veterans Home Guard in the Second. The latter comprised veterans of the First World War who had been honorably discharged and were still fit enough to serve. They protected military installations, guarded internment camps, and defended important industrial installations. The Home Guard was formed in 1940 as a way of accommodating those who wanted to serve but could not, due to their age, while freeing up younger men for more active duty. In addition, we had the Air Raid Wardens and Pacific Coast Militia Rangers, the Red Cross, and the 1st Cadet Corps in the valley. Although the latter was primarily a drilling opportunity for boys, the Cadet Corps did take on guard and patrol duties when a military plane made an emergency landing in Lister in 1942. During the Second World War, everyone, soldier or civilian, was expected to contribute in every way possible, and serving in one or the other of these civilian efforts was one way to do so. Local residents may have had an additional motivation for participating. There was someone in the Creston Valley with first-hand knowledge of Japanese military strength, Reverend A. Fulton of Trinity United Church. He and his family arrived in Creston in 1941 after fleeing the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, where he had spent 10 years as a missionary. He gave a series of lectures in which he outlined the probable progress of military takeover, industrial infiltration, and enslavement of the population should Japan invade British Columbia. One such lecture was given in early April 1942 at a civil defense rally stressing the need for precautionary measures against the enemy and the brutalities that an occupation force would have on this district if the enemy should happen to attack British Columbia. Both the Air Raid Patrol and Pacific Coast Militia Rangers were formed within a few weeks of that lecture. The ARP was a civilian unit, while the PCMR was under military control and was intended to serve alongside regular military units in home defense combat should the need arise. No one could belong to both groups, as an emergency that called out one would probably require the services of the other, and each group, according to the newspapers, must know exactly the resources upon which it has to draw. Once the war ended, both Veterans Home Guard and the Pacific Coast Militia Rangers were disbanded. It is possible that the Air Raid Patrol remained active after the end of the war, though probably only for a short time. The Red Cross, on the other hand, remained very active and played key support roles in the flood of 1948 and the near floods of 1957 and the early 1960s. Cadets, Air and Army, have had a fairly continuous presence in the valley since 1941, but since the end of the Second World War, their focus has been predominantly on youth activity and general community service rather than emergency preparedness. But the end of the war did not end the threat of enemy attack. It simply changed the potential enemy from Germany or Japan to Russia. Communism was expanding across Eastern Europe even before the war had ended, and Churchill made his famous Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946, less than a year after the war had ended. The full consequences of the nuclear bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were starting to emerge, and the USSR successfully tested its own nuclear bomb in 1949. So there was actually no period of time, even immediately after the Second World War, when the question of civil defense was not a thing. In October 1948, the Canadian government appointed the first peacetime civil defense coordinator tasked with managing federal, provincial, and local response to civil defense matters. For the first few years, the national coordinator was busy working out the details of federal versus provincial responsibility and determining how best to implement the civil defense system. By early 1951, though, all of that was settled. And in the summer of 1951, we start to see sort of weekly-ish civil defense bulletins in the local newspaper, followed by the announcement that the international border would be abolished in the case of a nuclear attack. By the spring of 1952, local civil defense efforts were taking a more concrete form. The provincial civil defense coordinator, taking his direction from the federal one, divided the province into regions, each with its own coordinator. And the regional coordinator, Major Matheson, in the case of the East Kootenay Civil Defense Unit to which Creston belonged, pushed the municipalities in his region to form civil defense units for their communities, each of which also had its own coordinator. On May 23, 1952, Major Matheson spoke at the very first civil defense meeting held in Creston. His purpose was to outline the duties of a local civil defense corps, explaining that it was to be organized along the lines of the old air raid patrol units and ready to handle any major disaster or emergency project. He also, according to the newspaper, gave an interesting description of atomic warfare and what the result would be. If he was hoping to reassure his audience, on the one hand, that organizing civil defense was an easy and familiar task, and, on the other hand, scare them into stepping up to do it, he failed. The newspaper story detailing the meeting concluded, as no local organization accepted the responsibility, it is proposed another meeting will be called in the near future. But Matheson must have had some impact, because only a week later, Village Council was reading a letter from William F. Craig, seen here standing near the center of the photo in the dark shirt, who was applying for the position of Civil Defense Coordinator for Creston. After considerable discussion, which the minutes of Village Council do not detail, but one gets the sense that at least part of it involved debating whether civil defense was even necessary, Craig is appointed. By the end of the month, he's had a 2-hour discussion with Major Matheson about his new duties and is busily putting his plans in place. The first step, of course, is finding a suitable location for civil defense headquarters. Since Village Council is supposed to be contributing to the costs, it makes sense that the headquarters would be located in a Village Council building, and the only one of those available is the old Village Hall on 11th Avenue North. It, as it happens, is occupied by the Creston Public Library. The library was already in its 7th home since being established in 1920, and its directors were, understandably enough, not terribly thrilled about being told they had to move again. This was compounded by the fact that neither Village Council nor Civil Defense Coordinator Craig had any reasonable suggestions as to where the library could go next. It required a long process of negotiation and an increasingly emphatic series of letters and phone calls to the library before the library was finally able to move, in January 1953, into a room provided alongside the municipal office in what is now the Jordan Financial Block. Logistical challenges aside, Coordinator Craig moves ahead with his planning, taking, according to the newspapers, the Herculean job of organizing the district in stride. He's spending his nights preparing detailed maps of the district, showing all potential danger points and gridded to scale to enable Defense Committee members to understand at a glance what is taking place as a potential disaster unfolds. By the middle of July 1952, he's able to announce the heads of each service to be provided by Creston's Civil Defense Corps. J.W. Scott is in charge of transportation, George Patterson heads up the communications department, and, reasonably enough, Corporal Elphick of the local RCMP coordinates with the police. H.A.M. Fisher coordinates the wardens, W.M. McFarland is in charge of welfare, and E.W. Mix oversees the engineers. Les Lund and Eddie Miracle, between them, handle fire and rescue. Russ Joyce takes care of the supply department, and Dr. J.V. Murray manages health issues. In March of 1953, East Kootenay Coordinator W.K. McRae, who had replaced Major Matheson the previous January, declared that Creston was the most organized of any East Kootenay municipality in civil defense organization training. These early successes aside, all is clearly not well in the realm of civil defense. First, there's some dissent in the ranks. Under the provincial civil defense structure, communities were designated either as target areas, expected, as the name implies, to be targets of an enemy attack, or reception areas, which would support target areas primarily by welcoming refugees and providing them with food, shelter, and medical attention. As Village Commissioner Amy Erickson explained at a council meeting in June 1953, Mr. Craig, the Creston Civil Defense Officer, had been giving the civil defense training for a target area, and as this was a reception area, it was the general feeling of the civil defense volunteers that such target area training was unnecessary. At the same time, Council Chair C.W. Perry declared his belief that Craig was really not suited to the trainees of civil defense after the training had proceeded beyond a certain point. The second issue is some apparent conflict between local coordinator Craig and his immediate supervisor, area coordinator Ken McRae. We just see it hinted at in the records available to us. For example, McRae, raising the issue of inappropriate training with Craig, seems to have created some tension, not only between Craig and McRae, but between Craig and his local volunteers, too. We see McRae attending village council meetings without Craig's knowledge, who only knows to attend because council asks him to. In March 1953, the newspaper is reporting on this tension. W.F. Craig, civil defense head locally, will have his entire case ironed out at a meeting this Saturday with the East Kootenay civil defense head, A. McRae, at the village hall. And in July 1953, when Craig resigns as local civil defense coordinator, McRae actually has to write to village council for confirmation, because he has apparently not heard that news from Craig himself. These are not indicators of a healthy working relationship between the two levels of civil defense organization. Issue number 3 is a clear reluctance on the part of village council to fund local and regional civil defense activities. In theory, each of the 3 levels of government were supposed to provide a third of the costs of civil defense. Nearly half of village council's discussions of civil defense revolve around those federal and provincial cost-sharing grants, and council hesitates to incur any costs while there's any uncertainty. Council's 1953 budget allocation of $525 for civil defense is given only begrudgingly at best. Twice we see Craig's request for expense reimbursements being tabled until later in the meeting and then conveniently forgotten. In June 1953, Regional Coordinator McCrae asks Village Council if they could pay Craig for his work in civil defense, and council minutes tell us that the commissioners were not in favor of giving Mr. Craig remuneration for the services he has rendered to date. It is possible that the tensions between civil defense personnel accounted for some of council's reluctance to fund it. There's also a suggestion that council may have resented having civil defense obligations imposed on them. Their letters to the library states that the provincial government is pushing them to undertake the work. We get the sense council is telling the library, if we have to lump it, so do you. When we take all of this into consideration, it's not surprising that local enthusiasm for civil defense fizzles out fairly quickly. In July 1953, Bill Craig resigns as local coordinator to take work in another community. For the next 6 years, we see virtually no mention of local civil defense activity at all, not even when a mysterious parachute is found in the forest near Yak. Cranbrook clearly supplants Creston as the most organized of any East Kootenay community, holding a very successful training exercise there in 1958. But in Creston, all we see is the 1955 suggestion that if civil defense is indeed so vital, perhaps the federal and provincial governments should kick in for a new hospital. And in September of 1957, Doug Foster being appointed as the local civil defense coordinator. But in 1959, civil defense gets a new lease on life, spurred, it seems, by that spring's high water event. Members of Village Council, East Kootenay Coordinator McCrae, and local coordinator Foster all discussed the need for disaster planning to respond to events such as these. Now, disaster planning is not an entirely new mandate for civil defense. Even as early as 1951, while the civil defense system was being organized, provincial governments were insisting, much to the dismay of the federal government, that it include planning for natural disasters, not just wartime crises. And in the intervening years, the perception that civil defense measures would be worse than useless in the case of a military attack has only grown. Originally, civil defense recommendations were based on what had been used in Britain during the Blitz, so we see less than helpful suggestions like this one from 1951, advising you to throw yourself flat on the ground if you're out in the open when the bomb strikes. Such strategies are widely ridiculed, given the increasing power and potential for devastation of the newest atomic weapons. People in small communities, such as Creston, are largely convinced that no one would ever take the trouble to bomb them, despite many posters and ads advising that accidents can happen, that bomber pilots might miss their targets, or that damaged aircraft might jettison their payloads over rural areas. Irene Murphy once told me that she felt a great deal of tenseness and uneasiness, but a lot of people found it easy to dismiss Cold War-era worries. Radioactive fallout was not likely to affect Creston, but fire and flood already had and almost certainly would again. So, preparation for nuclear attack is limited to encouraging people to build fallout shelters in their backyards and stock them with emergency food packages, such as those displayed as the Creston Co-op in January 1960. But the activities of the Civil Defense Unit, now under the direction of Bill Herkmer following Doug Foster's death as a student pilot in July 1959, focus on the local response unit to any disaster, nuclear or otherwise. At a civil defense convention in Creston in September 1959, the perilous position of Canada, sandwiched between the two Cold War superpowers, is discussed only briefly before Area Civil Defense Coordinator Ken McCrae, who certainly seems to have some staying power, commends the good work and planning that Mrs. Standage, Mrs. Carmichael, and Mr. Moffat have put into the expansion of the local hospital in case of emergency. They have somehow come up with a strategy to enable the 33-bed hospital to accommodate as many as 68 beds in an emergency. Hospital staff also manage the crates of emergency medical supplies on display here that the federal and provincial governments have supplied and which, during the Cold War, are stored in the basement of the hospital. We see another new civil defense coordinator, Tom Gauthier, attending training courses in Arnprior, Ontario, and a group of Creston residents applying to attend a search and rescue course in Kimberley. In reporting these activities, the newspaper emphasizes that the aims of civil defense are to save lives, care for the injured, protect property, and help the homeless, needs that are as likely to arise in the type of disaster that might befall the Creston Valley as in a nuclear attack. The local civil defense volunteers turn out alongside local farmers, the Red Cross, and Army units to sandbag the flats during the near floods of 1961 and 1962, and civil defense brass make a special visit to Creston in March 1962 in view of the wave of terrorism that has broken out. That's referring to the activities of the Sons of Freedom, who have been more active than usual over the past few years and who blew up the tower supporting the power lines across Kootenay Lake earlier that month. In the summer of 1962, we do see Frank Romano and the Public Works Department building a fallout reporting post alongside Town Hall under the auspices of civil defense. But that is in response to greatly heightened international tension that culminates that October in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Following that, the US and the USSR both pull back from the brink of nuclear war. And with the easing of those tensions, the work of civil defense dissipates once again. We have found very few mentions of civil defense after 1962. There is a new mobile disaster unit based out of Nelson beginning in 1963. And in May 1969, a civil defense agreement is signed at Eckhart Field in Port Hill, agreeing that both countries can use that little airstrip in the case of a disaster. The newspaper's coverage of that signing tells us that Bob Corner is now the local coordinator, and civil defense was sandbagging the flooding Goat River just a week or two earlier. And finally, in May 1972, local, regional, and provincial civil defense coordinators organize a mock disaster training exercise in Creston, using a school bus accident as the scenario. By then, emergency response is shifting focus at the federal level. The voluntary self-help measures of the early 1950s have given way to a national, integrated approach to disaster management. The federal civil defense system, already shifted from the Department of National Defense to National Health and Welfare and then to the Emergency Measures Organization, now moves to the Ministry of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. The program itself undergoes a couple of name changes to Emergency Planning Canada in 1974 and Emergency Preparedness Canada in 1986. The legacy of civil defense endures even today. Local search and rescue teams and fire departments have taken the place of the wardens and engineers that Bill Craig was organizing back in 1952. Province-wide initiatives like Fire Smart BC and BC Emergency Preparedness Week are still publishing resources for the public, though we do see much more of an emphasis on preventing disasters than we did when the key disaster we were preparing for was nuclear war. But let us hope we never need to resurrect those kind of pamphlets ever again. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Creston Valley Curiosities. We'll be back again soon with another fascinating story of the community. Please click on the link on your screen to make a donation and help us keep bringing you these videos.